Is this what you expected it to be like when you came to see Jesus? You'd heard about the miracles, the casting out of demons, the healing, the water into wine. You'd heard as well about the stories, wonderful and beautiful and freeing and strange. And you'd heard about the food, how it was always there in abundance. And so you went. You went along with many other people and you came to this place. There's so many others in this wilderness place. The crowd around you is full of energy, possibly full of danger. Years from now, writing about this scene, Luke will say that the crowd trampled on one another. It is like a mosh pit before the concert starts, the band 45 minutes late coming to the stage. The energy is electric and a little frightening. You gotta watch carefully lest someone trod on your foot. But a rough crowd, the occasional sandal on your toes, this is a small price to pay for the peace that you have heard that Jesus offers. Except when you finally see Jesus and the crowd flows and moves in the way that crowds do, and then it parts and you're looking right at him. You've never seen him before and there's no mistaking that it is him. Jesus does not look peaceful at all. He is pacing back and forth, and there is something wild in his eyes. Whether it's the crowd itself, everybody wanting something from him, or it's his critics who are always trying to trap him in some question, or just out of shot, it is the soldiers with their hammers and their nails and their swords. Jesus looks like he is a man hunted. He looks like he is choosing between fight and flight. And then he starts to speak. You people, he says, you think you're here for a picnic, but what you are going to get is fire. You think you were here for a guru on a mountaintop, a guy meditating with a beard, but what you are going to get is a man gone berserk. You think you're here for peace, but what you are going to get is war. You cannot even guess that the stress that I am under. You looking for peace? Nuh-uh. Nope. I'm going to set father against son, mother against daughter. The in-laws are going to get out their knives and their guns. I am like Facebook and Fox News and Alex Jones put together. By the time I am done with you, your eyes are going to be spinning in two different directions. So I spent quite a bit of the 111 days that I was away from grace thinking about the theme of forgiveness. Now, this was not by design. I didn't go away from grace saying, I'm going to wonder about forgiveness. This is going to be a focus of my sabbatical. Rather, what happened is that forgiveness just kept on burbling up in things that I read, in people I talked to, just in the everydayness of life. Forgiveness is something that I encountered over and over. Forgiveness is a huge theme for Jesus. Peter comes to Jesus one time and says, Lord, how many times should I forgive? It feels like 7 would be a reasonable answer. 7 would be plenty of times to forgive. And what does Jesus say in response? He says, no, Peter, you should forgive 77 times, or depending on how you translate Matthew's ancient Greek, you should forgive 70 times, 7 times. It would be a passable paraphrase of Jesus to say, you should forgive a gazillion times. Later on, Jesus is in a house and some friends bring their paralyzed friend to where Jesus is. And because they can't get in, they lower the paralyzed friend through the roof to where Jesus is. May we all have friends who love us that much. And in this moment, Jesus sure suggests that forgiveness is something heavier and harder and maybe more holy even than healing. Because this guy, this paralyzed man, lands beside him. I don't know if Jesus is a little freaked out about this, but this paralyzed man lands beside him, and Jesus says to him, "You're forgiven." That's the first thing he says. And it is only after his critics push him on this, accuse him of blasphemy, that he adds, "You're healed." And the man gets up and walks away. Forgiveness comes first. And what does Jesus say on the cross about forgiveness? "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." It's central to his ministry. Now, maybe under the influence of that particular genre of oil painting in which Jesus is abused and he looks sort of sad about the bad choices that people are making, but never particularly angry about it, we could imagine that forgiveness is not very difficult for Jesus. We might say to him, "Yeah, God, you're asking us to forgive 77 times or 70 times, 7 times, but that's easy for you. You are the Son of God. You are part of the Trinity. You can walk on water. You can raise the dead. You have never paid for a glass of wine in your life. You just ask the server for water, please, and somehow you always end up holding a glass of Merlot. You're not asking much of us. You're asking us to do something that you find easy." And maybe that's where the scene that we just witnessed today in Luke is so important. Because in it, we see Jesus being really wronged by other people, being pushed to his limit. As he is across his ministry, across his life, he encounters behavior that ranges from obnoxious through to deeply evil. And we see him pushed by the crowd, pushed by the critics, pushed by the soldiers, into a place where he entirely understandably blows his stack. He goes into this totally understandable rage. And that tells us that for Jesus, forgiveness is not this effortless thing. He's endured things that are genuinely not okay. And he has to figure out from there how to take his own advice, his own command to forgive 70 times, 7 times. This is good news, because if one of the great promises of the incarnation is that we can say to God, "You know what this is like. You know what it is like to suffer. You know what it is like to search and be lost. You know what it is to have the full joys of life." Then this scene tells us, "Lord, you know how hard it is to forgive. You've gone bananas with anger, and from there you've had to find your way to forgiveness. You know how hard it is to forgive." And friends, it is hard to forgive. It's hard to forgive because forgiveness feels like saying something is okay. It can feel like saying something is okay when it's deeply not okay. Sometimes something that someone has done or left undone has really, really hurt us. And maybe it also feels like, this might be sort of a variation on the okayness, it feels like forgiveness can feel like we're not seeking justice when we ought to be seeking justice. It can feel like a theology of forgiveness can feel like a sort of a doormat theology where we just kind of turn the other cheek. And what that means is we're just going to keep on smiling while people hit us. And forgiveness is hard as well because to forgive means that we have to let go of the power, or I'm gonna amend that a little bit, the apparent power that comes of being right and being wronged. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of stockpiling resentments. I have maybe done this once or twice. Then they did this, and then they did this, and then they said this, and then they did this. Can you believe it? And resentment stockpiling is a powerful thing to tell your friends about. When I have told my friends about how a community has mistreated me or a teacher has mistreated me, they've nodded in agreement and said, "Oh, they're so bad." And they've agreed that I am a martyr, that I have been ill-treated. It feels sort of great. It feels good. Until it doesn't. Stockpiling resentments is one of those superficial pleasures that is awesome, and we might sort of compare it to booze in this respect. That's great. It feels like a pleasure that you're choosing until it somehow can become this compulsion that is choosing you. All of a sudden, instead of choosing to list resentments, they become like this movie that is playing on the screen of my mind over and over and over, and I can't look away. We used to use the metaphor of the broken record for moments like this, right? The same part of the song playing again and again and again and again. Although, fewer of us, unless you're a hipster, fewer of us listen to records these days. So maybe in 2022, we should say this moment of stuckness is like a frozen Zoom call, right? To hear the same list of resentments again and again. It's like the screen is frozen and you're stuck looking at the one whom you resent, and they're stuck in this grotesque position, and you just can't look away. How do you get unstuck? How do you get away from that? Well, part of it, I think, is to say that is to realize that to forgive is not to say that what someone did is okay. Not at all. We can say that something someone did is deeply not okay and still forgive. And certainly not to give up on the search for justice. We know that people who forgive deeply actually seek justice, nurture justice really deeply. Jesus being the ultimate example of that. And maybe as well, it is to realize that this power that we thought we had over another person, it turns out that in holding on to resentment, they've got all the power over us. Suddenly they're running our thoughts, they're running our feelings, they're very nearly running our lives. This is maybe what that old expression means when it says that resentment is like taking poison and hoping that someone else will die. But how do you get out of that stuckness, out of that broken record, out of that frozen Zoom call? If you're Jesus, you finally escape from the crowd, you finally escape from your critics, you finally escape from the soldiers, at least for a while. And you're in this place where you're replaying the scene over and over, like, oh, they did this and they did this other thing and they wouldn't leave me alone, and they're just always trying to trap me with their questions. How does Jesus get unstuck, or how do you and I get unstuck? You may have guessed this is not an abstraction for me. I've talked about earlier about stockpiling resentments, and early on in my sabbatical, I realized that I had stockpiled a resentment and was replaying again and again and again this resentment. The object of my resentment was controlling my life, and I said, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. This is not any fun anymore. I am locked into this place of embitterment. And thanks be to God, I got an email, not a personal email. It's the email list from Richard Rohr. Maybe some of you will be on Richard Rohr's email list as well. And in it, he talked, one of the wonderful holy coincidences of sabbatical. I was struggling with resentment, and suddenly Rohr shows up with an email about resentment, and in it he said, what if you said to your resentment, I know who I am without this resentment? What if you said to yourself, I know who I am without this resentment? And that kind of became my mantra in kind of the first third of sabbatical. The movie would start playing, the record would get stuck, the Zoom call would freeze, I'd be staring at this resentment, and I would say, I know who I am without this resentment. And I could just slowly, initially it was hard, but as I kept going back to that mantra, I have found that I was more and more able to let that resentment go. What if forgiveness is to set down the chain that binds us to the person who's wronged us or the community that has wronged us? What if it's to set down this chain and say, I know who I am without this resentment. I don't need you to be punished in order for me to be whole. I don't need you to be hurting in order for me to be whole. I don't need you to have some kind of comeuppance in order for me to be whole. I know who I am. I wonder if that's what Jesus does when he goes off by himself, because Jesus sure knows who he is, doesn't he? He knows better than any of us that he is this beloved child. He knows that he is the Son of God. He knows that he's made for purpose and joy and fullness of life, for meaning. In the prayer that Jesus teaches to his disciples, he says, what does he say about forgiveness? Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And I suppose we could read this if we wanted to as sort of a quid pro quo, so that God forgives us provided that we forgive our neighbor. And I don't know, that doesn't actually sound like very good news to me. I don't think we have to read it that way. I think rather we could read it as saying God forgives us. God does not need to hold on to a chain of resentment binding God to us. God knows who God is without that resentment, knows deeply who God is without that resentment. And as God puts down that chain, we're invited to do the same. We are invited to behave in a God-like way, in a Christ-like way, and put down the chain ourselves. Forgive us our sins, letting go, as we forgive those who sin against us, letting go. There's freedom in this. Again, freedom that does not say the wrong was okay, does not get some kind of kumbaya peace with being wronged, but rather says, I don't need some violence to be done in order for me to be whole. I'm still going to seek justice, but I'm not going to be bound to you in my need for punishment. Let's end where we started. Is this what you expected it to be like when you came to see Jesus? Well, maybe in spite of everything, the answer is yes. Because in seeing Jesus fly off the handle and seeing Jesus become deeply angry at the way he's been wronged by the crowd and by the critics and by the soldiers, in seeing him become totally overwhelmed and blow his stack, we get to follow him as he finds his way to forgiveness. We get to follow him, and if we dare, to emulate him as Jesus finds his way to peace.